name is Ryan Grover. I'm the Sewell C. Biggs Curator of American Art at the Biggs Museum of American Art. And it's my job to take care of the collection. I've been here at the museum for about 17 years. And in that time, and the museum itself is about 27 years old at this point. So under the time that I've been here, the collection is pretty much doubled. So a lot of what it is that I do here is just sort of collect and bring in and add more stories and find ways to share those stories. The team here at the Biggs Museum have been really terrifically turning the content that we would normally have within our institution, within our galleries, and turning it into virtual experiences, which has been unbelievably exciting for us because we're reaching new audiences, and we're really just very pleased with that. So the Biggs Museum was brought together, like I said, 27 years ago in order to house the collection of a guy named Sewell C. Biggs. And Sewell was born and bred a Delawarean. He had lived most of his life in Delaware, and from really early on in his life, he started to dedicate himself to collecting antiques, especially antiques at first, but then started moving into American painting and American sculpture, starting in the 1970s. And for probably just over 60 years, he was professionally collecting towards the aim of opening a museum. And the Biggs Museum, what came from his efforts was a collection of American art from about 1700 up to the present, emphasizing the state of Delaware and the Delaware Valley. And so we collect really broadly, from like New York to DC, all over sort of the eastern United States. And we collect from about 1700, the year 1700, up to works that are still wet. But we collect a lot of furniture, a lot of ceramics and silver, different kinds of metals. We collect a lot of American painting, a lot of American sculpture, and we do a really sort of, how do I say this? A really ambitious exhibition schedule. So we try and bring new stories and new ideas to people all the time. And it's just, it's been really fun. It's been a really terrific experience being here. So the talk that I'm going to be giving you today, we sort of dubbed it Rings of Fire, and you'll see why in just a couple of minutes. But this was actually a talk that I gave at a conference on industrial lighting about a year and a half ago. And I was asked to come in and speak at this conference because I had this background in thinking about the effect that lighting has had on historical art forms. So if new technologies arise, then the vision that it creates allows us to think about new art forms, new techniques, new styles, and you can kind of trace the history of American art history with the introduction of new lighting technologies. And so I'm not, it's just sort of a fun kind of exploration of technology, and at the same time looking at gorgeous paintings and interiors and fun things. So with that, I think I'm gonna get going. So a little less than 20 years ago, I was the author of a master's thesis on the aesthetic effects of pre-industrial lighting forms, especially candle lighting, upon fashionable architectural interiors of the 1600s through about 1840. I was inspired to research the ways that lighting levels could have affected the evolution of style in Western interiors. I discussed in this thesis the silhouettes, the colors, surface design, textiles, and metals that were most fashionable in the style periods of William and Mary, the Baroque, the Rococo, Federal, and Empire in relation to the lighting technologies and techniques of each of those time frames. Although not cited in my thesis, I was thinking a lot about rooms like the one pictured here. The image is created by a guy named Edward Petrovich Gau, and it's of the private cabinet or personal art galleries of Catherine the Great's Italian art collection in what is now the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, Russia. I carefully described how small bits of flickering light from chandeliers and movable torchères in rooms like Catherine's cabinet, managed by an army of servants for the benefit of elite observers in small parties, were reflected in the countless shiny surfaces diffusing illumination over its decorative displays in a dramatic and shadowy environment. And you can see the chandelier sort of hanging in the second room and the torchères sort of spread throughout the gallery spaces. While I happily made a place for oil and even kerosene lamp lighting within my initial study, I strictly cut off any discussion of industrial gas lighting. It wasn't fussy enough. It was too predictable, too ubiquitous. Gas lighting was just one small step from electricity, and both represented a standardization of an intensely brighter and artificial illumination that washed away the poetically lit interiors that were romancing in my mind. In the years since that thesis, I've had the chance to oversee an interesting collection here at the Biggs Museum. My responsibilities there include the management of a comprehensive fine and decorative arts collection that spans from around 1700 to the present, and among its many strengths is American paintings of the 19th and early 20th century. I've grown a tremendous appreciation for the rapid changes in the American art world during this period, especially in painting. And it wasn't until recently that I realized that there may be profound connections between the subject of my thesis from so long ago and these artworks of the Industrial Revolution, sort of the period of the American Civil War until the first decade of the 1900s, so that 40-year period. I was sure that industrial lighting could partly or perhaps better explain the radical formal evolutions of the fine arts at this time, as well as the evolution of the spaces where art was learned, created, and exhibited. I argued in my thesis that 18th century portraiture, along with its contemporaneous furniture and wall colors and architectural decorations and, everything, were a product of, among other influences, the lighting technologies that consumers could utilize at that time. In a time when luxurious decorations were so prohibitively expensive and such a clear sign of elevated status that your fancy blue dress had better look equally good during the day and at night. By comparing aesthetic ideals of different style periods, like the Baroque portrait of Anna Dorothea Finney on the left, with a Federal period portrait of Maskell Ewing on the right, interesting observations about visual acuity began to appear. John Hesselius depicted Anna Dorothea Finney as a stylized representation of a young woman shortly before her wedding. He laid upon her many time-appropriate symbols of status, including the bold blue satin dress, a double strand of pearls, and even the so-called almond-shaped eyes popularized in Northern European and American portraiture of the Baroque period. The depiction of her flesh is fashionably pale, even luminous, and the artist records her image under rather extreme frontal lighting conditions. She casts very few shadows. Her entire visage is thrown in light, causing a visual flattening of the volumes of her body and clothing. Her central, almost statuesque importance within this image is further dramatized by the dark outlining of her form, as well as the strong contrast of her colors against the dark background. The formal elements of contrast, bright colors, lack of shadow, and outlining are a successful combination for paintings that will be shown in dim locations, such as the interior of homes illuminated by candles and simple lamps. Please trust me, this artwork shows very well under dim conditions indeed. I have firsthand experience taking kids through the museum on flashlight ghost tours, and Anna Dorothea's ghostly visage is a big hit. By comparison, Charles Wilson Peale painted Maskell Ewing on the right at a time when lighting consumers could and did secure brighter illumination for fashionable interiors, such as the Aragon lamp that you see in the blue background, just to the left of Maskell Ewing's portrait. These brighter interiors during both the day and the night allowed for the introduction of delicately decorated furniture with fine painting and inlaid designs and a progressively paler palette of pastel colors, for interiors of clothing, as seen in the buff waistcoat that this gentleman is wearing. Easy and more regular access to brighter illumination also allowed for a greater appreciation of fine detail within painting. Maskell's wedding portrait is cast in a comparatively heavier shadow, creating the illusion of a fashionably voluminous belly. Peale is more interested than Hesselius in depicting a true likeness of a sitter, and we viewers feel that we are witnessing a less idealized, more realistic depiction of the man. This corporeal connection with Ewing is heightened by Peale's depiction of a very human, flushed cheeks, as well as the sinuous and veined right hand, visual qualities not attempted in the Hesselius portrait. And really, these visual qualities are only recognizable under a more intense lighting technique than the candle. In the next century, fashionable American painting continues this trajectory of classical realism and establishes its study as a fundamental core of education in the emerging academies of fine art. The academic approach to painting is achieved through intense study of your subject, an economy of painted surface, and a heavily practiced, even individualized approach to laying paint down on a surface. Winslow Homer, on the left, has largely shed all the artifice and decorative refinements of the last century to focus on this study of youth in building a subtle psychological tension as this girl peers sadly through a window. The viewer is drawn into the symbolism of the potted flower on the window ledge as they grow towards the light, and we can't help but associate their confinement from nature with that of the married sitter. Similarly, Thomas Eakins excels in his study of textural differences under fading light sources. He masterfully renders the delicate weave of the pink dress and human flesh with a strong and dramatic use of shadow, plunging this sitter into near silhouette. The movement into shadow across her face reinforces Maud's expression of perhaps resignation, as we the viewers marvel at the really exquisite draftsmanship of her eyes and textile folds. This level of detail and chiaroscuro are the dramatic movement, or the dramatic movement from illuminated to shaded areas within a work of art would not have been appreciated by the candle or even whale light of the previous centuries, but in a new, even brighter illuminance and lighting technologies. This trend towards observing and recording the quote-unquote real world was also most certainly observed in the evolution of American landscapes as well. Near the end of his life, Thomas Cole, the father of American landscape painting, combined elements from his notes of several locations to create this fanciful evocation of the Hudson Valley on the left. No portion of this landscape is specifically identifiable to a particular place, as Cole celebrated American topography with the stylized language of British landscape painting of the previous half century. Lush dancing trees mirror the shapes of cloudy storms rolling from the left to the right across the sky, framing the intense light of the summer sun shining on a distant mountain and across an untamed and by this time fictional forest. A new and heightened sense of realism alternatively rises in Albert Bierstadt's view of Niagara Falls on the right, demonstrating the artist's acute observation of the types of trees, rock formations, and undergrowth surrounding this particular view of the falls. He attempts to transport the viewer to this remote and celebrated wonder of the world through the expression of an infinite detail and captures a vantage point that will be copied by many artists in the future. His specificity is his trademark, and Bierstadt received many commissions in his career to explore the most memorable scenes of America and interpret them for Eastern patrons hungry for the illusion of adventure. Bierstadt becomes a seminal figure in the Hudson School of American Landscape Painting, the first group of artists concerned with elevating views of this continent to the level of high art internationally. The appreciation of his work demands a new level of concentration and an almost scientific display of nature. This period of American art history is taught much like an epic novel, but perhaps for good reason. The advancement of academic observation and an almost scientific rendering of the natural world by Bierstadt's contemporaries leads ultimately to a kind of artistic revolution near the end of the 19th century, Impressionism. As more artists learned the methods to render the quote unquote real flawlessly, individual interpretation of the artist's own perspective, both intellectual and physical, becomes increasingly more important to patrons and the growing middle class art market starting in the 1860s and 1870s. William Merritt Chase was an early American supporter of plein air painting, a technique of painting that gets artists out of their studios and into fresh air to embrace their artistic subjects directly. Like his haystacks, probably painted during one of his classes hosted at the art colony he developed in East Long Island, Chase taught academically trained artists to utilize their classical skills to complete an entire painting in one sitting. He wished to impress upon his students the unique effect of light and weather conditions on the color and textures of the natural landscape. The resulting works were often completed, at least mostly completed, on site in just a few hours to record the environment, the unique environmental conditions upon specific scenes. To accomplish the task, these works were painted in a rush and often lacked the complex and detailed renderings of mid-century painting like Bierstadt's Niagara that we just saw. Chase's loosened brushwork records an impression of the scene, allowing the viewer to complete the image within their own imagination, and places much greater emphasis on the way he left paint on the canvas, his own personal signature. Much attention has been given to understanding this fast-moving evolution in American art history, from Cole's idealization through the introductions of academic realism into Impressionism in only about 40 years. Most art professors teach that this rapid change was the product of two main forces: the French influence, French techniques, such as 19th century classicism taught in French academies and in the Barbizon school taught outside the French academies, as well as, and then secondly, the invention and marketing of packaged tubes of pre-mixed oil paints. No more grinding one's own pigment and minerals to create the paints as you needed them. Tubes of paints became commercially available, were easily transported, and due to mechanization, much more reliable in both texture and color. At this point, I would also like to add to this list of influences the adaptation of industrial light forms in both artist studios and in museums to lend this same level of industrial reliability to the visual perception and appreciation of modern artworks. Industrial lighting allowed for the first time the widespread ability to examine and record intense levels of visual detail within painting. Furthermore, modern lighting allowed viewers to begin to appreciate the unique textures of layered painted surfaces as another component of artistic accomplishment. With the aid of fixtures, such as those taken from popular trade catalogs in the 19th century, see a couple of examples here, one was able to see all the exact details that the artist wanted to impart. And as we will discover, these modern lights allowed this to happen for ever-growing crowds of art enthusiasts and practitioners. Artist studios before industrial lighting technology were often designed with northern exposures to take advantage of less intense, more diffuse daytime light sources. Artists working at night relied on candles or lamps. Many artists worked in isolation in small studios. Furthermore, most artists received their instruction from artist masters within these same studios before the widespread establishment of academic centers of art training, such as the Pennsylvania Academy, pictured here. The Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, or what they call PAFA. PAFA's students and artist studios were located on the first and subfloors, so basement floors of the purpose-built Academy building on Philadelphia's North Broad Street, which opened to the public in 1876. These studios were equipped with an early form of gas-powered track lighting, with directional reflectors to aid in the artistic observation of fine detail by large classes exhibited in this racy photograph of the 1880s. And I hope that you can sort of see those metal panels in the upper left corner and the upper right corner of this photograph. Notice how close the students hover around their model, and imagine this same scene flooded with the light that could emanate from the two lighting fixtures suspended from the ceiling. When I was doing research for this, as a side note, I was doing research about PAFA's early studios. So there are naked people in almost all the photographs, which is fantastic. But PAFA was really well known for wanting to get their students directly in front of their subjects, really just bringing the subjects right into the school. And even to this day, PAFA supports days out of every academic year where they bring in livestock into those studios. There are great photographs from the 19th century of barn animals and pigs and cows and such roaming around in the studios as artists are sitting there trying to depict them. It's hysterical. PAFA's famous cast drawing room, the repetitive drawing from plaster casts of classical sculptures, was a foundation class of the art school's curriculum. And it demonstrates the artist's reliance on industrial light forms as well as natural light. And this is the gallery space. Well, it's two scenes, one day and one night scene depicted in this slide. The daylight image on the left records the range of lighting fixtures utilized within the space, including directional tracks and diffuse drop lighting, both powered by gas. You can see the sort of gas chandelier as well as those long paneled, those sort of reflecting gas reflectors suspended in front of the window. On the right, in the photograph on the right, we see that these lights in action as the room has been transformed for night students studying a brightly lit costumed model. And she's sort of central to the photograph. While these powerful lights allowed students to observe and interpret the level of visual detail necessitated by academy instructors, they also made possible round-the-clock artistic production. The Pennsylvania Academy and many of its contemporaries in artist instruction, such as the Art Institute of Chicago, the Art Student League in New York, and the Corcoran School in Washington, D.C., stayed financially viable in the 1870s to the 1890s by expanding their curriculum to include industrial arts like design and illustration, which in turn attracted additional students and tuitions who occupied night classes. It wasn't until I began studying this photo in particular, entitled Open Studio, that I feel that I began to understand the aesthetics of art display in this period. In this classroom, students grouped themselves into a few groups of activities with sculptors at the bench and life drawing of the woman in the hat taking place in the foreground. With a feeling of having been a little staged, kind of like a publicity photo, my eye focused on the background of art projects compressed into a tight display under the illumination of the circular and T-shaped lighting fixtures. Having taught art history courses in art schools, I was familiar with a student's presentation of their work for class criticism by their instructors and their peers, a way of evaluating your success and progress, and another basic tenet of art academy curriculum. These works vied for attention and occupied a rhythmic pattern across the viewer's eye level. At the same time, the works occupied the space that would be best illuminated by both daylight as well as by nightlight. What struck me is that this arrangement existed less for decoration and much more to be observed. This was an arrangement that begged for criticism, for an intense study of the finished work, a kind of visual reading of the room, one row at a time. It reminded me of this important artist studio of William Merritt Chase. Photographed and painted extensively by Chase, his students like Reynold Beale, but also by the newspapers, magazines, and even tourists, Chase's 10th Street studio was among the most fashionable and important interiors of its day. Artists had long exhibited their own works in small studio spaces adjoining their working studios for street traffic, kind of like little retail spaces next to their studios. And patrons, a practice that dates, this practice of having like a little shop window dates to the 1700s in America, but Chase, on the other hand, used this interior as his calling card. In this interior, Chase embraced a very Victorian notion of creating thoughtful arrangements of art and curiosities to delight the eye. After studying PAFA Studios, however, I had to wonder if there was something more to his demonstration of horror vacui. What seems terribly old-fashioned to viewers today was highly celebrated by the close of the 19th century. Chase was famed as much for his novel painting as his thoughtful integration of disparate objects and forms to create compelling compositions and evocative narratives. What many of us might call hoarding today may have been better understood by his contemporaries as a visually rich environment for academic study, contemplation, and especially comparison. Perhaps this could be viewed as a cross between the artist's own cabinet of curiosities and a space for the public critique of his work. This room, illuminated by gas fixtures in its vaulted ceiling, was a personalized environment for the detailed examination of the artist's own wares for sale. In this heavily lit interior, the aesthetic principle unifying its appearance seems less about art appreciation and more about public scrutiny. As we move from industrial lit artist studios of the late 1800s, we can begin to see how the same lighting techniques may have affected public reception of the modern artworks of this period. We look to art museums for a better view. The first museum in America was established by the artist Charles Willson Peale in Philadelphia in 1786, and the self-portrait of 1822, pictured on the left, demonstrates all of his interest for the space. His paintings, his animal specimens, and prehistoric fossils. In the background, the rows of boxed dioramas are stacked opposite a large window that is obscured by Peale's tantalizing curtain. And through you see a glimpse of his prized display of an ancient mastodon. I hope that you can sort of see that skeleton sort of silhouetted against the window. Ever the showman, and concerned that his museum would be a money-making venture, Peale demonstrates his own sophistication and graciousness with the additional display of a series of oil-fed argon lamps hanging from the ceiling. By adding them to his own portrait, Peale partakes of the time-honored tradition of demonstrating status, whether real or perceived, through conspicuous lighting. And when I gave this talk the first time, I had a gentleman come up to me afterwards who it turns out he was sort of like a foremost scholar in argon lamp sort of history. And he said that Charles Willson Peale's importation from England of these argon lamps, and you can see a couple of them hanging from the ceiling of his museum space, was the first example of American argon lamp chandeliers in America. The Western world of the early 19th century was in fact only just getting used to the idea of public museums, a building concept that picked up steam in the 18th century, in 18th century Europe, as a specially built location for the public, not private, display of curiosities of art. I looked again to another great Philadelphia institution to begin thinking about the ways that industrial lighting, especially gas lighting, may have influenced the display of artworks during the 19th century, the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. As the inheritor of much that was first established at the Peale Museum, PAFA opened in Philadelphia in 1805 under the guidance of Peale and sculptor William Rush. As a European-style art school, PAFA also started displaying large-scale art expositions in 1807. The museum and school operated in several locations before trustees hired Frank Furness and George Hewitt to design its current iconic building to open in 1876, and that building is pictured on the right. This image on the right is taken from the grand staircase inside the main entrance that leads visitors to the galleries on the top floor. This image of 1890 allows its viewers to peer into the upper galleries upon a display of paintings under the museum's trademark glass and iron ceilings. You can see them through the arched window, or through the the sort of arched arcade in the gallery level. What is also visible is the two sets of gas lighting utilized to activate the space. You can see the pipes hanging for the sort of the gas-powered track lighting in front of the paintings, as well as the sort of stationary torchères of those illuminated globes that flank either side of the stairs. So this next photograph on the left was taken a few years earlier of PAFA's main hall on the top floor of the museum, looking back toward the entry stairwell that we were just looking at. John Lau's monumental sculpture is positioned within the center of this enormous gallery that is decorated with metal architectural elements reminiscent of industrial machines and gears. It is also positioned under a similar form of gas track lighting as ones we saw earlier in the artist studio and in the artist studios in the rooms below, in the lower floors of PAFA. In this case, the simple pipes are punctured with a series of small holes that operate similar to a gas oven today, firing a steady stream of small flames that create a solid source of light washing down on the walls of sculptures and paintings. Additional lights can be seen suspended in the distance of the vaulted skylight. Notice that with the exception of the Battle of the Lapiths and Centaurs, the large sort of sculpture grouping in the center, all the other sculptures have been backed up to the walled surface lining the galleries and are not displayed to be appreciated in the round. The view on the right is from within PAFA's Gallery F in the year 1893. The placement of this gallery's early gas lighting suggests that its designers attempted to replicate the direction that light naturally falls through the museum's skylights, and in so doing reinforces the limited range of space where artworks could be seen within these vast rooms. Although no detailed invoices have yet been found, and judging by the simple design of each of the systems pictured, the track lights within the museum were probably custom built, perhaps even by the gasworks company supplying this location. Before studying this topic, I followed what scholars reported that I accepted and followed what scholars had reported that early public museums attempted to emulate the European palace galleries of the past by adapting the so-called salon fashion of installing paintings in the manner shown in the Hermitage on the left, a range of works scaling the walls from floor to ceiling. This may have been true at times with later museum projects, but it appears as if the paintings displayed in Gau's Russian image and in many similar descriptions of princely collections across Europe, these paintings are principally placed to create a gracious and pleasing rhythmic order to the geometric shapes of frames that ultimately harmonize with the architectural elements of the gallery. By contrast, in the PAFA interior on the right, the artworks are tightly packed into the areas that will uniformly receive the best illumination. The Hermitage for Catherine the Great was a room of trophies, while PAFA was a cinematic conveyance of work by historic and living artists. The stream of images at PAFA is meant to be taken in as one steps forward, like studying a scroll as it unravels. The Hermitage was not initially designed to be uniformly lit for large audiences over long periods of time. It was adapted from a private residence to a public institution in the later 19th century. It would be interesting to know if gas lines were added at that time. Alternatively, PAFA was designed to accommodate large crowds from the outset, as if rising to the challenge of American reformers who argued for greater access for the working class to urban leisure opportunities and wholesome later night entertainments. PAFA's lighting technique, casting bright illumination upon fully covered walls at all hours, accommodated many new ideals for art appreciation at the end of the 19th century, an economical use of space for an ever-growing crowd. Finally, the display technique at PAFA, especially in its presentation of work by living artists, seems to share more with Chase's New York Art Studio and PAFA's classrooms than with Catherine's trophy room. The work is laid out at eye level, grants little negative space, and invites close examination. In fact, a security bar has been installed to keep visitors from getting too close. This display technique and bright conditions signal viewers to examine closely the details of the paintings, whether the textural signatures or a visual symbols. In this space, if this space is created for any one person, it's for newspaper critics. Apparently, the gaslighting technique utilized within Pappas galleries was by the 1870s already a thing and could be seen in other newly formed exhibition institutions. This wood engraving of 1872 shows a review of the opening reception of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in its first location on Fifth Avenue in New York City. The Met's first home was a former dance academy that had been adapted to display paintings and sculptural objects on 3 floors. These adaptations no doubt included the gas track lighting that can be seen circling the ceiling. In relation to the skylight, the ceiling can also be imagined as a vent for the high amounts of heat that would have been generated from this form of light. You can almost imagine the sort of the flame sort of looking at this kind of track lighting, the heat that's generated, and then the windows, the windowed sort of ceiling sort of opened up to allow that heat to be released. A third example of this rarefied lighting technique can be seen in James Renwick's design for the public museum as well as private rooms of Washington, D.C. art collector William Corcoran. James Renwick was inspired by the Louvre Tuileries edition in Paris and modeled this gallery in D.C. in the Second Empire style that was then the height of French fashion. As in the first 2 museums, the installers of these massive collections seemed focused on filling usable lighted surfaces with an array of paintings. The largest high paintings are even pitched forward, contoured to the arc of artificial light. This photo also allows the viewer to see the actual design of the gas piping system, a long row of gas spouts set in a comb-like regularity. And I think you can kind of see them sort of spiked towards the wall. Here's another example. I've attempted to locate early examples of European institutions that could have offered inspiration to the designers of America's first museum lighting systems. The earliest I could find was the set of photos published on a short article describing how the Edinburgh Museum in Science and Art, the Edinburgh Museum of Science and Art still retained the 1866 fixtures of its original gas track lights. The lights can be seen running the length of the hall under the skylights and in close-up in the image on the right. These Scottish tracks are designed to illuminate the entire three-floor gallery at the center of the museum and attest to the illuminating power of these gas lines. The track system, in concert with other lighting devices, must have made a profound new lighting effect for ever larger interior spaces dedicated to the aesthetic display of art and artifacts. These massive industrial interiors rely as much on modern architectural forms of iron and glass as they do visually on the intensity of gas lighting. It seems fitting that my study of gaslighting within the American art world would end on this image of a collecting institution dedicated to the taxonomical display of art and science. After all, I've been arguing that the 19th century audiences were taking a more studied and ultimately critical position on art creation and appreciation under a lighting technology based in modern science. My last slides, however, introduce the next stage of these parallel evolutions in art and technology. Maybe even another paper, who knows? Childe Hassam was deeply influenced by the abstracting force of post-impressionism. His pointillist application of paint in small, compact dabs of contrasting and complementary colors leave a visual field that vibrates with tension and movement. Less interested in the scene that he depicted, Hassam delights in the substance of paint, the actual sort of the paint of paint, and the depth of subtly modulating colors across the picture plane. He is trumpeting the arrival of the 20th century and all the next range of artistic somersaults artists will achieve through abstraction and intense focus. And how will audiences appreciate this work? Under electrical spotlights, not the wall-washing gaslights of the 19th century, but with a gracious amount of space around each picture, signaling the importance of the artist's individual accomplishment. Thank you. So that is the end of my talk, and I wanted to open this up to questions. If anybody has any questions, feel free to hit your space bar and ask away. In the meantime, I'm just going to show you some little previews of things that will be coming up in future programs, including of the virtual tour and lecture series that you're a part of right now. We have the virtual tour of the Award Winners 20 exhibition. That will be, I think, next Tuesday. I have to get that lecture in place. I'll be back on July 21st to give the first sort of public presentation of some very new research that I've been doing about the occurrence of slave ownership by early American craftspeople, especially cabinet makers here in the state of Delaware. But it's a good indication and a good idea about slave ownership amongst cabinet makers all across America at this time. And then we also have our virtual illustration workshop, which will be happening Tuesday, July 25th, and it should be super excellent. I'm really looking forward to that. So again, let me ask now, are there any questions, any slides that you would like to see again? So I have a question or a comment from Olivia White. This reminded me of a prehistoric cave paintings from 30 to 40,000 years ago that came to life with torch flames, making depictions of animals look like they're running, etc. Interesting to think of how much lighting affects, how lighting affects how we see art. And I couldn't agree more. And it was conversations like what you're describing that caused me to be thinking about lighting in the first place. It was in those caves, the figures were activated by the motion of light, and would create these kinds of I don't know, kind of exciting sort of moments with the subjects. And so it seemed to me that through all of this, that lighting had little recorded, but ultimately really profound effects upon the sort of aesthetic sort of interest of those things that were being illuminated. Other questions, other ideas? Again, feel free to hit your space bar if you have any questions for me.
Well, I was just going to say that I remember the Rembrandt lecture that you had that was on lighting. That was a couple of years ago, and I thought that.
Were we talking about a little bit earlier time frame than this one?
Yeah, it would be. Now that I think about it, you're right, because Rembrandt obviously is much earlier. It was his sketches.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that, you know, I feel like, you know, we talk about it in terms of sort of contemporary design and how important light is. If anybody's ever redone their kitchen, you know, one of the big things you talk about is like how much light can you fill into these spaces, especially spaces where you need to have sort of intense study. And, you know, if nothing else, just to be able to see the food that you're preparing, but to be able to read recipes and all these different things. Filling your spaces with light is a relatively new thing in the world of human experience, but one that has become incredibly important. And I think that I think that it's had pretty profound effect upon the design of furniture, appearance of interior decoration, fashionable clothing, the development of different kinds of textiles, and even and then ultimately to the visual arts, to painting and sculpture. I think that I think that these new technologies, from candles to industrial lighting, in the span of 140, 150 years. This is fast. This is really, really fast. And I think ultimately we're sort of talking about the movement across the sort of consumer revolution into the industrial revolution, and all the sort of just myriad changes that occurred socially, but in terms of our own sort of aesthetic universe during that time. I think it's a really exciting time to look at things. But I'm also a big nerd, so you pick. Well, if there are no other questions, I'm going to sign off. Feel free to reach out to us here at the Biggs Museum. My email is rgrover@biggsmuseum.org. Feel free to contact anytime. Our contacts are on the website, so you're more than welcome to, if you have any sort of follow-ups to this lecture. I do really recommend that you engage with us in the future projects. The award winner show is particularly good, and we're going to do a lot of sort of mashups between poets, musicians, and visual artists in next week's presentation. And then the research that I've been doing on the enslaved craftsmen are it's nuts. It's really, really interesting, and there are just there are so many good stories that are floating from it that I'm really, really excited with where this is going. The illustration class, if you are inclined, well, the great thing about doing classes online is that you don't actually have to share your progress. You get to try these things out for the first time. So buy a class, get into it, or buy a class for somebody else if you want. And we'll see you all really soon. Thank you very much for coming tonight. I appreciate it.